Welcome everybody to our presentation on Know Your Learner. My name is Helen Kowalenko, I'm a Senior Educator, and my other presenter with me today is
Helen Panos, and I am a Special Educator. We'd like to firstly acknowledge and appreciate the work and the extra work that educators have done this year with the difficult circumstances, and know that you're all working really hard to support your children and students that you are teaching. You will see that there are hidden slides that appear on your PDF version that we will not refer to in this presentation but are included as an additional resource. The intended outcomes of the PD is that you know your learner, that you will identify barriers to learning and functional need, that you will understand the personalised learning process, and that you will plan and document adjustments. Personalised learning, this is taken from the NCCD. Every student has their own aspirations, learning needs, strengths and interests, and it is the responsibility of preschools, schools to respond to every child, student and their unique characteristics with high expectations for achievement. Providing personalised learning and targeted support is one way to achieve this. Throughout our presentation, we are hoping that you will see links with the disability standards for education and legislation, waves of intervention, NCCD, the Australian curriculum and ELF curriculum, One Plan, IESP, and Teaching for Effective Learning, just to name a few. One of those links is to Learning Design Assessment and Moderation Strategy, and I want you to focus on the red square that is highlighted about developing expertise in designing learning that engages and intellectually challenges every learner. This also has links with the Inclusive Education Policy. There are 4 areas in personalised learning which reflect the teaching and learning cycle. Assessing and identifying the needs of the child, student, consulting and collaborating with the child, student and their parents, guardians, carers and other professionals, providing adjustments to address the identified needs of the child, student, and the important monitoring and reviewing the impact of the adjustments. We will be unpacking these during this presentation. The key aspects of personalised learning are that you know the child or student, that you are consulting with others to look at what's happening and to inform your planning, that inclusion is at the core and the child or student is at the centre of the process, that your adjustments are evidence-based and skill building and strengths-based, and that you are rigorous in monitoring and reviewing what you are doing. Barriers to learning identifies the child's or student's difficulties and the underlying issues that impact on functioning and participation. It may sound like a negative term, but is often the entry point for discussion to identify learning priorities. And these barriers can be documented as a growth point in a One Plan and part of the rationale. Some common barriers to access, participation, learning and engagement may be delayed fine and gross motor skills, limited communication skills, safety concerns, difficulties with self-regulation and anxiety. This is not an exhaustive list, but just an example, and I'm sure that you can think of others as you reflect on the children or students that you teach. This next slide relates to a child with autism spectrum. We collect data, including our observations, to determine the barriers and functional needs. If we look at the first barrier of reactivity to sensory triggers, noise and hunger lead to non-compliance, some possible data or assessments that we can use to determine this as a barrier is the Understanding Behaviour Template, the ABC Behaviour Observation Form, and then from that we can formulate the possible functional need of using alternate safe strategies and skills to effectively manage strong emotions. This slide relates to communication and difficulties following instructions as the first barrier identified. Some of the assessments obviously would firstly be your observations of the child and their response to how they follow your instructions, but also levels of questioning, an articulation screener, which would then link to possible functional needs of needing to attend to a speaker to use listening skills, to hear and understand sequenced information, and be able to remember and recall verbal information. As we look at this slide, you can see that the barriers and functional need are sequential and focus on that one skill development. So what do we mean by functional need? And here we refer to a classification developed by the World Health Organization, which describes functional needs as referring to the supports, skill development that a person needs to enable them to participate in activities on the same basis as their peers. So the implications of these as an educator is what skills does your child or student need to develop, and that's what you really need to focus on when you look at the barriers, on what explicit skill teaching do they need to help them participate. If we focus on what skills or supports the child or student need in order to function successfully in the current learning context, we can use the example here where the barrier is that the student is often dysregulated and will engage in a range of externalised behaviours. The possible functional need would be to develop alternate, safe strategies to manage strong emotions. Once we have established the barrier and the possible functional need, we will then focus on the adjustments which Helen will speak about.
As Helen has gone through the last few slides, taking you to this point, adjustments are a word that seems to be coming up in our world of education more and more. And what are adjustments exactly? How do we know which ones we should be doing? All of this clearly links with knowing your child or your student. Once you've established what you think the barriers are, then you'll be able to possibly work out what the functional need of that child is, and then you'll be able to develop the adjustments. So you'll be asking yourself, how will this support the inclusion, build skills and independence? Who's actually doing the adjustments? What are they actually doing? How often, the frequency, how long, how many times a week or a day you'll need to do them. It becomes much more clearer than just going straight away like we tend to as educators just to fix it. It's much more explicit. In order to determine the continuum of adjustments that you might need to put in place, it's really important to have an idea of the levels of adjustments. So now let's look at the different levels of adjustments, because they're going to give you an insight into the types of programs and resources and interventions that you're going to need to be put in place. You will find that in the handouts, when you print this off, there is more information about all these different levels. So let's start with quality differentiated teaching practice. It is a word, again, that I think you're hearing a lot of. And it is something that we do every day in our classrooms with all of our students without really doing a lot of thinking about. It is actually the building blocks that underpin all the other adjustments. And sometimes we don't really look at what we're doing in a sequential way because we don't necessarily value those everyday things that we do, because we're always looking for the extra supports. So those things that you have already in your classroom, like visual timetables, you might be providing students with opportunities to do smaller pieces of work, they're all quality differentiated teaching practice. No one expects to see in a classroom these days one maths sheet for 25 children. So apart from quality differentiated teaching practice, you are going to have those students or children that require more than that. So the other three levels that you can see on this slide are the supplementary, substantial and extensive. And I know that on any given day you may think that particular student or child needs extensive support. But in actual reality, only 10% of our students actually require that level of adjustment. So when we go back to the supplementary level, we can see that this is a level that for children and students who require sometimes adjustments. So they don't need it all the time. They may need it for a literacy block, they may need it for a numeracy block, but they don't need it very often every day. And this is where you would have some very explicit goals that you have in mind, and this would be where in a preschool, an ECW, or in a school services officer might be asked to come in and work with the child in the class or in a small group. The substantial, however, are for those students and children who require more than that, more frequent and require more targeted interventions, and therefore there would be planning around this child that would clearly reflect that. And the supports that you would be looking for would be much more frequent. Quite often, a lot of these children would have autism or may have global developmental or intellectual delay, and they're requiring significant adjustments across many areas of the curriculum. For those that are extensive, we're talking about that smaller end of the continuum. These might be children with physical disabilities that require supports for their everyday life at school, very high needs, and they wouldn't be able to function without having that level of support. So even though I'm sure, as I said, that on any given day you might think that some of your kids need that extensive kind of support, they are a very small population of our children. Keeping in mind that the adjustments clearly are focused on what the adults are doing to develop the students' functional needs and their learning processes. So please take the time after the presentation to go back and have a look at the extra slides that we've provided you, particularly around the quality differentiated teaching levels of adjustments. I think that will provide you with even a clearer picture of what kind of adjustment you're actually thinking about or even considering, and also about what you as a teacher under quality differentiated teaching are doing every day. And I know this does take time, it just doesn't happen, but many of our learners can benefit just from quality differentiated teaching. Now, having identified the barriers, the functional need and the levels of adjustments, where to next? It's important that we document all of this information, and I know that this can look different in different sites. Some people are still using the document of the NEP, others the One Plan. It depends on where your school or site are up to. But it is clear that this needs to be documented somewhere. So as you can see on this slide in front of you now, this is what the One Plan looks like, and this is a good place to be putting all the information in and documenting the levels of adjustments. A good place to start might be using this following document that can be used as a mapping tool. If you're wanting to start with something that leads you along this continuum from barriers of learning right through to smarter goals, maybe this is something that you would use to start you off in the process before you then place the information in a One Plan or in an NEP. So this document is really trying to highlight for you the place to put the information that you know about your learner. So starting from the barrier and then determining what the functional need are, what kind of adjustments. Now the adjustments are clearly those interventions that you are going to be put in place. We've talked about them in broad terms. In this document as a planning tool, you're going to be able to write down what kind of strategies, what kind of supports, how often, how you're going to implement them, and who is going to implement them. You can really draw out what is going to be quite different for this child other than the quality differentiated teaching that you're putting in the classroom. Before we actually move on to a real-life student or child in the next part of the presentation, I think it's really important to note at this stage that the barriers, the functional needs and the adjustments need to be connected. So, for example, to develop a range of gross motor skills, If the adjustment was one-to-one SSO for multi-lit sessions, this would clearly not connect and would make no sense whatsoever. So the connection needs to be absolutely keyed in to the adjustment. So, for example, develop a range of social skills to interact positively with peers, the adjustment of the one-to-one SSO support for a structured social skills program using What's the Buzz resources, focusing on micro skill of turn taking, is very clearly connected to the functional need and to the barrier. Because you would have identified in the barrier that that child is unable to interact positively with peers. They have limited social skills. So when you're writing these, you need to make sure that it's clearly connected right back to the barrier and that the adjustment is very targeted at the skill that you're trying to teach. As you can see from this slide, there is more evidence of how these things are connected. And I think if you get a chance afterwards to clearly have a look at this so that you can actually make the connections between the barrier, the functional need, the adjustment. And we haven't talked a lot about the smarter goal, but all of this flows very well to provide you with clear adjustments and the clearer goal that you are trying to achieve. So in terms of writing the smarter goals, which you will need to be doing once you've worked out what the barriers and the intentional teaching are, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that today. You'll see on this slide, it gives you some of the key elements that you'd be considering when you are writing them, but I would be encouraging you to participate in some of the other online workshops that the One Plan is presenting during this expo, because they're going to be looking at them in much deeper detail, and I know that there is a workshop in the early years and one for older students. So I would encourage you, if you're looking for more support on how to write them, to take your time and have a look at the workshops that are also being presented. So at this point that we're going to move forward with a scenario.
We are referring to a fictional case study about Taylor. What I know is that there is a diagnosis of ASD, ADHD, learning difficulties and communication delays, that he is a Year 3 student and he accesses a range of therapies through NDIS, including OT, speech and psychology. Helen, are you able to expand on how Taylor presents?
So let's start with some of his strengths. He loves construction, PE and drawing, has a great sense of humour, enjoys talking to adults about interest. The next are a few of the areas that he is having more difficulty with. They would include transitions and changes. He avoids non-preferred activities, mostly writing tasks. Will wander around the classroom rather than engage with the task. He does have high sensory reactions to noise, and he can become quite dysregulated, which might see him participate in some concerning aggressive behaviours towards others. He does have a lack of social skills, poor executive functioning. He does find it difficult to understand others' perspectives, and he is not a risk taker in his learning. The assessments indicate that he has delays in literacy, but he would prefer at times not to participate at all, just in case he gets something wrong.
So Helen, I can see that you have documented one of the barriers to learning here around dysregulation, emotional dysregulation due to ASD, sensory and anxiety. How did you determine these barriers?
Well, some of it would be from an observation as a teacher in the classroom. Some of it might be from some reports that I have from an occupational therapist or a psychologist, or his original diagnosis may have highlighted some of these barriers, and from talking with his parents. But a lot of these behaviours is actually what we're actually seeing in the classroom. And I guess I've tried to link it to a bit of a hypothesis as to why I'm seeing this. So the emotional dysregulation is probably my hypothesis about why I'm seeing this. And that would have come from, as I said, my observations, reports, conversations with other professionals and their parents.
So Helen, it would make sense to connect that barrier to the functional need of using alternate safe strategies and to develop skills to effectively manage strong emotions. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that would be the functional need, that we would have to develop his skills in that area in order to be able to effectively manage his strong emotions. So we've worked out what the barriers to learning are for Taylor and the functional need. Now what about the adjustments? So you can see we've given the adjustments in two different colours. One in red, which is around what the teacher of the classroom could do with some support from the SSO, some of those basic things, like putting a stop sign on the door, creating safe places for calming, using ear defenders, and whole class interceptions after breaks. But the top adjustments are very clearly about more direct support that an SSO would be able to provide Taylor with. So without going through each of them individually, you can see that the SSO is going to explicitly teach Taylor and model how and when to use strategies. We're going to have the SSO to supervise regular breaks outside of the classroom, meeting his need to leave and to have some downtime. There's direct SSO support and scaffolding to break down the task and support him to start the task. These are all key areas that we see that Taylor would need to support the development of that functional need and skill.
So Helen, we can see in the adjustments that there is some very explicit skill teaching and that it connects nicely with the functional need and the barrier. And the connecting smarter goals could be that Taylor will use at least 2 strategies to self-regulate with reducing adult support 3 times a week by the end of term 3, 2020. And Taylor will start a task using visual schedules with gradual release of responsibility at least 2 times a day by the end of term 4, 2020. So they're very specific and measurable.
So we know, after describing Taylor and some of his needs, that we've been able to identify some barriers under his social skills. So he has limited social skills. We know that he finds it difficult to take turns, and we know that he does have difficulty understanding others' perspectives. Gained that knowledge from more so from observations in the classroom and out of the classroom, and also from some of the information that was shared through the psychologist's report. So we've determined that from a number of different areas. So now we need to look at what will be the functional need or skill that we would need to teach.
So then, Helen, my understanding is that the connecting functional need for the barrier of limited social skills is that Taylor will utilise a range of social skills in order to interact positively with peers, and that Taylor will understand others' perspectives.
So let's connect the adjustments to the barriers for learning and the functional need. You can see that some of the adjustments are very clear about direct SSO support at identified yard times in supporting him in being able to play with his peers. There is support that is before he actually gets into the yard, preparing him with social stories and visuals, even as far as choosing a peer to participate. The SSO is also pre-teaching some game strategies for losing, using social stories and what's the buzz and other different resources, because Taylor needs a lot of this intentional direct teaching before he actually starts playing with others in the yard. And an SSO is able to do that in a more direct way than the classroom teacher through quality differentiated teaching. So you can see that there are a number of direct supports and programs and interventions that are planned specifically to support Taylor to remove some of those barriers that he has around the social skills.
So Helen, what we haven't done in the adjustments section is that we could actually put some timeframes around this explicit skill teaching. So if we take the first one around identified yard times, we might say that that's 5 times by 30 minutes a week. And that way we can put the frequency and duration of that intervention in place. And following on, the smarter goals then that connect to those adjustments, functional need and barrier to learning would be Taylor will play a game with his peers with adult support 3 times a week by the end of Term 3, 2020. Taylor will identify his emotional state using his personalised escalation scale at least once a day by the end of Term 4, 2020. So there we see that we have elements that are measurable, identifiable, and can check whether Taylor is meeting those goals. Some other possible barriers that we are not going to expand in this presentation with barriers are difficulties with fine motor skills, significant delays in receptive and expressive language, and difficulties with working memory. You can see that we are picking kind of one barrier at a time rather than clumping a few together so that we can unpack each one and the adjustments that we are putting in place to address that barrier. We would encourage you to have a go yourself at filling in those blanks for functional need, adjustment and smarter goals at the end of this presentation.
Now we're at the point that you would have used the mapping tool and implemented some of the adjustments. And if you remember back to earlier slides, one of the critical parts of the personalised learning process is to monitor and review. So you would be looking about how things are going, what needs further adjustments, has your hypothesis been right about the barrier, and where your child or student's progress is at. As part of the monitoring review, you would be obviously having connections with other professionals. If there are new reports by that occupational therapist or a psychologist, you would be using these to perhaps change your documentation, your interventions. So we know that as educators, it's always important as part of the work that we do to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our students and children, that we are always using critical reflection on what we are implementing and the goals to see whether or not we are making a difference. Because really that's what it's all about. What difference are we making? Have we removed or changed some of those barriers for that student so they're able to function in our classrooms as successful learners?
On the last slide, we have included some current information that you can access on the intranet to inform your planning. Helen and I thank you for your participation in this presentation and really hope that it assists you in understanding personalising the learning for your learners.